This morning, as I said, we begin, traditionally this is called the Passion Week, and I'm not sure, not a big church historian, so I don't know if Passion Week comes from the Greek word for Pascha, which is suffering, or the Latin word passeo, which is suffering. But either way, this week has been called Passion Week. And the reason it's called the Passion Week is because this week marks the most intense suffering that Jesus went through. So on Sunday, he rides a donkey into Jerusalem and is hailed as the king, and by the end of the week, he's being crucified. And then next Sunday, we'll celebrate the climax of Christian history, world history, the resurrection of Jesus. But this week, we kind of roll into it, and we look at this last week of Jesus' earthly life. And so what I typically do, I do this for the Christmas holidays, and I do it for Easter too, is I begin to read the gospel accounts of either his birth or his last week. And so this week, to be honest, I got a little lost. And I read my daily Bible reading, I read through the HCSB, the Holman Christian Standard Bible, just because it's a new translation and kind of gets me out of the familiarity. And so I have it on Kindle, and so I went to, I was trying to think in my head, okay, the Passion starts around Matthew 20. And so I click on chapter 20, and I start reading, and I realize I'm ahead of, the Passion starts in 21. That's when Jesus has a triumphal entry. But I keep reading chapter 20, and I was just very convicted by what I read. And I think it's no accident that that's the last story that's told before Passion Week. And that's what I want to go over. That's what I want to work through today, because I think it's no accident that the last sort of teaching before this week begins was directed at his disciples, and it's a very pointed lesson to the disciples, and I think it's a very timely word for us today. And so what I want to do this morning is look at this parable, but I want to look at the context of the parable first, and then we'll look at the parable itself, and then I want to see why this parable is so important with regard to Easter and Easter week. So open your Bibles to Matthew 20, and let's begin by looking at the context of this parable. Matthew chapter 20, it's on page 825. I'd encourage you to grab a Bible from under your chairs, and we'll be able to look at a couple of passages that give us the context, and then we'll read through the parable itself. Again, this is leading up to the last week of Jesus' life. This is probably maybe the Saturday before that Jesus is talking with his disciples. And all of what happens in this chapter, and I think what goes on through the narrative of the death, burial, and resurrection, begins in chapter 18, verse 1. And so if you want to turn back 2 pages, page 823, chapter 18, verse 1, this is the driving question that drives the rest of the chapters in Matthew's gospel. Chapter 18, verse 1, at that time the disciples came to Jesus saying, "Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" Now you can imagine the disciples. Like, on one hand, we could give them the benefit of the doubt. And we could say that the disciples are truly concerned with who's the greatest. It would be like you in your career just starting out. You graduate college, you get on your first job, and you think this job is going to be a career. And so you go find who the best is in that particular field, and you ask them if they would mentor you, or if you could at least have lunch with them so that you can ask them about what it would take to be great in this field. Like, you want to get to the end of your career and look back and go, yes, I was as successful as I possibly could be. And you want that advice up front. So on the one hand, we could give the disciples the benefit of the doubt, and they're like talking to Jesus, right? They've been with him for 3 years. They're getting ready to enter this last week. They still don't get what this week is going to be about. And they're like, hey, Jesus, how do we be great? But that's not really what's going on. What's going on is the disciples are a little bit like, we've been following you for 3 years. And we're the ones who, when you said pick up your cross and follow me, or drop the fishing nets and follow me, we're the ones who followed you. And now we want to understand what the pecking order is here so that we can climb to the top of that pecking order. So, Lord, who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? Because in their mind, they're not looking forward to death, burial, and resurrection. They're looking forward to the kingdom being established. And if the kingdom's going to be established, we want to be up on the top of that kingdom. And so you see this play out, and we see why this is the real context. If you just look ahead into chapter 19. In chapter 19, there's the famous interaction that Jesus has with a wealthy young man. In the ancient world, wealth meant success. So different from today, isn't it? But it meant like you had God's favor because you were wealthy. And so this rich young ruler comes to Jesus and he says, hey, I'm doing it, man. I'm following you. I'm doing all the commands. What else should I do? And Jesus says, well, are you following this command? He's like, yeah, I'm doing that. Are you doing this command? Yeah, I'm doing that. Okay, here's what you need to do. Sell everything and come follow me. And you remember, he gets sad and walks away. And the disciples are a little rocked by this. And so what does Peter say in chapter 19, verse 27? Then Peter said in reply, see, we have left everything and followed you. What then do we get? What do we have? And if you skip ahead to chapter 20, you see James and John. Their mom has a similar request, right? Chapter 20. Her mom, chapter 20, verse 20, then the mother of the sons of Zebedee came up to him with her sons, and kneeling before him, she asked him for something. And he said to her, what do you want? And she said to him, say that these two sons of mine are to sit, one at your right hand and one at your left hand in your kingdom. This is what they want. Now, it's no accident that this story is framed in dealing with Peter and James and John. Who are his three most intimate disciples? Peter and James and John. If anybody had the opportunity to be, quote, great in the kingdom, right? Do we not get that in our culture too? Like, it's not what you know, it's who you know. Jesus, we're like your buddies. We're like your best friends. What's in it for us? And Jesus frames this by telling a story. And the beginning, the last verse before our story begins is, the first will be last and the last will be first. And the last verse at the end of our story is, the first will be last and the last will be first. So Jesus is making a point here. You want to be great in the kingdom of God, then you need to have a different understanding of what greatness is. In our world today, we measure greatness, I can use one word, comparison. Every single area of our lives is influenced and affected by comparison. Why do you do what you do? Because it's compared to other people. It starts when we're little kids. It starts, what toys do you have? Oh, yeah, but I have this one. What video games do you have? Yeah, but I have this one. And then you get a little older. What kind of grades did you get? Yeah, but I got these grades. Or you don't care about grades? Well, but I'm good at this sport, and I'm good at that. And there's all this comparison. And I'd love to say it stops when we get married, but it doesn't, does it? Because you compare your marriage to that marriage, or you compare your spouse to that spouse. And then you have kids, and you have so much to worry about, you don't think of it anymore, do you? No, because then it's like my kids compared to your kids, or my kids compared to those kids. How much did your baby weigh? When did they start walking? What was their first word? Supercalifragilisticexpialidocious? No, I'm kidding. But it's comparison. Our whole lives are comparison. And so when Peter and James and John, when they're framing, and probably all the disciples are listening in, when they're thinking about who's the greatest, it's about comparison. I want to be greater than them. I want to be higher on the pecking order than they are. That's the context for this parable that Jesus tells beginning in Matthew chapter 20, verse 1. Now that we have the context, let's look at the parable itself. Matthew chapter 20, verse 1. For the kingdom of heaven is like a master of a house who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. After agreeing with the laborers for a denarius a day, which is just a day's wage, nothing special about that figure, it's what they would expect, it's what they were going to get. He sent them into his vineyard, and going out about the third hour, he saw others standing idle in the marketplace. And to them he said, you go into the vineyard too, and whatever is right I will give you. So they went. Going out again about the 6th hour and the 9th hour, he did the same. And about the 11th hour, he went out and found others standing. And he said to them, why do you stand here idle all day? And they said to him, because no one has hired us. He said to them, you go into the vineyard too. And when the evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his foreman, call the laborers and pay them their wages, beginning with the last up to the first. So that first and last thing is key to this. It starts the parable, it ends the parable, it's right there in the middle of the parable. So just to give you some context at this point. The landowner, property owner, goes to Home ED. And he sees some workers out front in the parking lot. And he says, hey, I can do some work in the yard today. I could use some help. I'll pay you a day's wage. The guys are grateful for the work. He's grateful to have the help. Load up in the truck, and they go to his property. This is the 6 a.m. crowd. They start working, they get going. 9 o'clock, he has to do what every home improvement project has to do. You got to go back to Home Depot. And so he goes back to Home Depot at 9 o'clock, and he picks up some more guys. We could use some more help. Hey, you guys come, and I'll pay you what's right. He doesn't say a denarius, he says what's right. And so the normal person would think basically 3 hours less wage than what the 6 a.m. guys got. And then at 12 o'clock, he's got to go back to Home ED, and so he goes back. He asks for some more guys. They come on, and they go. He does the same thing at 3 o'clock. And then at 5 o'clock, if he's like you, he's frustrated. Now he's like, gee, I got to go back. Not really. But he goes back to Home ED. It's an hour before quitting time, and he's like, hey, why aren't you guys working today? And there's nothing negative about this. Their reaction simply says, we haven't been hired. Now, we could read into that. I don't think we need to read that much, but some people have read into it. Well, these are like the smallest guys. These are the guys who can't really work as hard as the other guys. Like, you're picking the best workers as the day goes on, and this is the last guys who are left, and the landowner says, all right, come on, you can work for an hour. I'll give you what's right. So 6 a.m., 9 a.m., 12 p.m., 3 p.m., and 5 p.m. 6 a.m. crowd will give you a denarius. 9 a.m., I'll give you what's right. 12 p.m., I'll give you what's right. 3 p.m., I'll give you what's right. 5 p.m., I'll give you what's right. So let's find out what's right. Then he says, picking it up in verse 9, and then those hired about the 11th hour, this is the 5 p.m. crowd, came. Each of them received a denarius. Now that's what parables do, is there's like something shocking here. It's like, wait, they worked for an hour and they're getting a whole day's wage? It's like, whoa. You're the 6 a.m. guys. You're last in line. What's going through your head? Whew, I'm going to get like 3 or 4 denarius. Right? Isn't that what you're thinking? Like, man, he's paying them a denarius? This is awesome. And they're getting excited and they're getting pumped. Look how the parable does it. It just kind of skips right over the rest of the crowds. And it says, now when those hired first came, they thought they would receive more. But each of them also received a denarius. And on receiving it, they grumbled at the master of the house, saying, these last worked only 1 hour. You have made them equal to us who have borne the burden of the day and the scorching heat. It's not fair. Right? Isn't that? Have you ever heard that in your house? It's not fair, but it's not fair. That's what these guys are like. Wait a second. We got hired at 6 a.m. They got hired at 5 p.m., and you're giving them the same wage you gave us. Notice the comparison word, equal to. You're treating them like you're treating us. You're making them equal to us. In verse 13, but he replied to one of them, friend, am I doing you no wrong? Did you not agree with me for a denarius? Take what belongs to you and go. You see what happened? If the 6 a.m. crowd had gotten paid first and never heard a word about what the landowner paid anybody else, is there an issue? No. When does the issue arise? When they compare themselves to the others. When they make the comparison, all of a sudden, they're bothered. And they can't stand it. Why do they get what we had? Do you see why this is so important to Jesus' disciples as they enter this last week? Are you serving me because you want status? Well, here's what's going to happen. I'm going to die on a cross, and I'm going to be humiliated, and you're going to be humiliated. If you're doing this for status, you're going to walk away. You don't do it for status. You don't do it to rise to the top of the pecking order. In fact, it's just the opposite. If you want to be great in my kingdom, if you want to be a great follower of me, you have to serve. And the moment we begin to compare, we lose sight of God's grace. We cripple God's grace and its ability to work in our life when we live comparing ourselves to others. And this is exactly how the landowner corrects him in the parable. Look at verse 14 again. Take what belongs to you and go. I choose to give to this last worker as I give to you. Am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? Or do you begrudge my generosity? So the last will be first, and the first will be last. So let's take it one at a time here. Look at verse 13 again. But he replied to one of them, friend. Now, when we hear that, I think we read that and we think that the landowner has a bit of affection for these guys, right? I mean, you just read that English word friend and you're thinking this is, come on now, friend. But that's not really the word that Jesus is using here. This word it's only used 3 times, what's called the vocative sense, and that's just a direct address, 3 times in Matthew's gospel. And this is, if we can get that going up there, is that first quote coming up? This is how one scholar summarizes the 3 times that it's used. It says, it is used in cases where the person being addressed is insolent or deceitful and is being confronted and exposed. And you're thinking, well, that's a lot of freight to put in one word, because I hear the word friend, and that's not what I think, right? Aren't you like kind of going, well, what you talking about, Willis? Well, he gives us the other 2 examples, and listen to these 2 examples. Probably help if that was user error, by the way, I didn't turn it on. Matthew 22, this is 2 chapters later, there's this parable, that one of the next parables that Jesus talks about at a wedding feast. The invitations go out, and nobody wants to come to the wedding. It's kind of a parable about Israel not recognizing Jesus as the Messiah. So he goes, go out, invite anybody you find, get them to come to the wedding. And so these people come to the wedding, and then the master shows up at the wedding, and this is what happens. So he said to him, friend, how did you get in here without wedding clothes? The man was speechless. Then the king told the attendants, tie him up hand and foot and throw him into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. It's not much of a friendship there, is it? And the last time this word friend is used is when Judas enters the Garden of Gethsemane. Friend, Jesus asked him, why have you come? To betray you and have you arrested. So you can see this word friend is not the word that we would typically use. That what Jesus is, or way he's telling this story, is this is the heart of the issue. He's exposing what's in the heart of those first workers. Those first workers who were totally happy to be working and get a day's wage until they started comparing themselves with the other people. And it's the same thing in our lives. That we start comparing ourselves to other people, and all of a sudden we're blinded to God's grace. And instead we're comparing ourselves with others. And so that then Jesus says, and this is the verse that just convicted me when I was reading this last week, is, am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? And then the HCSB, which is, again, the version I've been reading through, says, are you jealous because I'm good? Or are you jealous because I'm generous? And just think about that. Do you ever get a tinge of jealousy because of the way God has blessed somebody else? Literally, in Greek it says, is your eye evil because I'm good? You get that evil eye, that stink eye, because I'm good and generous with other people? It's so easy to fall into that trap, isn't it? Lord, why do you give them that? Lord, why did you bless them? It doesn't take anything away from us. It didn't take anything away from those guys. But it still ruffled their spirits and made them miss the grace of God. And we do the same thing when we compare ourselves with other people, when we look at that blessing that God has given them and we don't. So what does this have to do with Easter? Here's what it has to do with Easter. It is impossible to look at the cross, to stand in front of the cross, and to compare yourself with somebody else. There's no way that I can stand in front of the cross and stand with Ron Dunnitz next to me and look at it and go, yeah, but I'm not quite as bad as he is. And yet that's kind of how we live our life, isn't it? Through comparing. And yet when you stand in front of the cross, you have this realization that you are a miserable sinner in need of the mercy and the grace of God. And everybody is. There's nobody who stands in front of the cross and gets a little bit ahead of everybody else in the line. It's like ludicrous to even think that way, but that's the way we live our lives. And so here's my challenge this week for Easter week, for this week of Passion, is to think about that, to meditate on that, to remember the grace of God that has been shown to us through the cross. To realize that as you stand before the cross, it's just mercy and grace that has saved you. And as you think about that, what rises in your heart is gratitude, and what diminishes in your heart is bitterness and jealousy. And I want you to pray that God would convict you Lord, where am I bitter? Where am I unforgiving? Where is that area of my life where I'm comparing and living out comparison? And as I do that, and because I do that, I'm crippling the power of your grace in my life. And if you will do that this week, when we celebrate Easter next Sunday and the resurrection of Jesus, there will be an experience of God's grace that you've never had. The only thing that keeps us from experiencing that grace is the bitterness and the unforgiveness that comes when we compare ourselves to others. Don't compare. Simply live in light of the grace of the cross. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we give you thanks this morning.